Welcome back to today's episode of Words of the Wise. Today I have Chief Petrilli from Normal PD in Illinois, 27 years experience in law enforcement, and he has amazing knowledge and experience in the wellness space. So I'm really looking forward to having him on today's show. Welcome, Chief Petrilli. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paige. I'm honored to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
I am as well. When we first connected, your knowledge on wellness, I'm really excited. I'm excited for you to share your experience and all the things that you know. But I was hoping maybe first we could get a little bit of background for those who don't know you.
Yeah, sure. I guess my kind of journey towards wellness, hopefully folks can relate because I'm going to be a cop talking to cops or a cop talking to first responders. So it's definitely been a learning curve for me. But as far as my background, I got hired with Normal PD here in Illinois. We're located centrally right here in the middle of the state, just about an hour and 15 minutes south of Chicago. I tested with this one department. I was hired right away and essentially have spent my entire career with this department. I've been fortunate enough to be exposed to all facets on our operations and support services side. So I really have kind of worked my way through the ranks. Obviously chose the leadership track about midway towards my career, spent some time as a sergeant, lieutenant, and an assistant chief until being promoted to chief. So for me, it's been, my career has been with one agency and I couldn't be happier with, all the opportunities I've been afforded here.
Did I tell you when we talked offline that I used to live kind of near you guys?
No, I don't think you did.
Yeah. So when I was 21, I had like I need to move and experience the world thing happened to me. And I got a job. I actually got a job first in Rosemont. And then I packed up my car, drove out there. I had never lived away from Phoenix ever. It was May and it was snowing when I got there. And then I moved to Naperville and I lived in Naperville, like Warrenville area
Oh,
for a little while. So I'm familiar with where you are. My question to you is, do you think that it's really important to have a variety of different roles and different perspectives in order to be the best leader that you possibly can?
I think it does, especially when we talk about leadership. And then I kind of want to draw that correlation with the wellness
Yeah.
kind of topic that we'll be talking about as well. But from a leadership perspective, the more that you can be exposed to every facet, every role within the police department, you will be a better leader at the end of the day. I mean, the more exposure that you have to different specialty units, different problems and creative solutions for solving them that you do at different levels, that builds that bank of experience, and you get the reps doing that. And there's no better teacher than experience, right? You can get so much out of books and conversations, but I think the best leaders are the ones that have done the job. So that I think that is huge when it comes to that experience factor for leadership. From the wellness side, I will say now when I look at kind of how we're approaching wellness within this profession, having been exposed to maybe working on a SWAT team, maybe working in a vice narcotics unit, spending time, in the training unit, you see your schedule ebb and flow, right? You deal with different stressors and the things like your sleep cycles when they change. A lot of those things really, you start to see the ebbs and flows, the peaks and valleys of being a first responder and how does that sometimes negatively impact your health. So when the conversation that we get into a little bit today, I think a lot of my experiences, I lived through those and was able to kind of learn from them and then put systems in place to sometimes right the wrong, if you will, when it comes to wellness.
And I would imagine that it also, and I think it's in both contexts, like you said, it could be in leadership, but it could also be in wellness, that it teaches you empathy and emotional intelligence to have that experience of living different perspectives, in different roles. I think so often, and this is a thing that I've experienced, at least in the wellness space, and I've also heard, through my conversations, on this podcast, that sometimes we're so set in our own perception, our own experiences, that we're not open-minded to what other people may be going through. And I've had that experience in my life where I'm like, well, that wouldn't affect me. So why is it affecting you? But I think the more that we can put ourselves in other people's shoes and have different perspectives, the more empathetic and more emotionally intelligent we can be, the more open-minded we can be, and then the better the whole will be.
I agree. And having that recognition, like you just said, that when you have that recognition of what other people may be going through, because let's face it, when you work at a police department, it's one crisis to the next, right? Every day. And a lot of times, the priority isn't always your people, right? But as you're exposed to different facets of the police department, and you start to understand what folks are going through on a daily basis, it really does put the focus back on the people doing the work. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Empathy is probably the best skill that you can develop throughout your time in this career field.
Yeah. And I know that you come from a background of athletics. You were an athlete yourself, and then you also helped to train professional athletes. In a world, professional athletics or college athletics where training, recovery, all of those things are non-negotiable and it's a kind of a part of the culture and what you guys do. How do you think that shaped your approach now as the chief of an organization coming in and prioritizing wellness?
Yeah. So when you work with, people that are destined for college athletics, or even if you rewind it a little bit more to just young athletes that are learning how to develop the skill sets and body awareness and some of these skills that develop them into good players at the teenage level, then into high school, into college, and some that are fortunate enough to play professional athletics. When you look at that kind of carryover, and the work that's put in, it's a discipline, perspective that they take when, that you got the difference between motivation and discipline. And I think that discipline to get up and to do the work, to be trainable, to be coachable, to be able to accept criticism, and really always be moving towards what your goal is, right? And I think that is the most important thing when we look at any success in any type of career field. I think you can take some of those attributes that I just mentioned there and apply those, and that's what you see a lot of times. People that are successful at achieving their goals, they've got that discipline, they've got that work ethic, they're trainable, they're coachable, and that's no different in law enforcement.
No, I agree. And, I've said this before, and I truly believe that one of flexes, my biggest flex is that I'm trainable, I'm coachable. I've always taken a lot of pride in that. And I think that the moment that you stop learning, you stop growing. And sometimes you don't know it all. And so to have, like you said, that open mind, to be trainable, to be coachable, to take constructive criticism, I would kind of add to that is, I try to always learn from people who I aspire to be or who do it better than I do. But I also agree that a lot of people wait for motivation, and motivation is fleeting. But if you have discipline, that's going to trump motivation all day long.
100%. And I think with that too, when you're trainable, when you're coachable, that also brings kind of a sense of humility, right? People that are humble, that don't get so full of their accomplishments, and that tends to take the focus off themselves, and they bring up the people around them too, which I think is huge. That especially in leadership, and that can be in any career field, that's your job as a leader, is to bring the people around you up to a higher level, right? And I love that old adage that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, right? So choose those people well, right? So if you're a leader, you really need to be a role model, and you need to be emulating, you need to be putting those skill sets, putting that the things that you want your people to do, you need to be living that.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, what parallels do you draw between elite athletes and law enforcement? Because I do think that there's a lot of parallels, and sometimes maybe people don't recognize that or don't see that in themselves, that in this profession, there is a sense of elite athleticism. Can you maybe explain what you see and how those relate to each other?
I do. And a lot of that, I think one of the bigger ones comes back to a sense of purpose, mission, teamwork, um, goal setting, like we've already mentioned. I think those are very specific kind of correlates between those two.
Yeah.
And also having that sense of discipline, right? We'll probably hit on that several times today, that having that discipline, having the integrity to do the right thing when no one's looking, right? You talk to most pro athletes, the ones that are very successful, they're doing the extra reps whether no one's looking or not, right? So that integrity piece, I think you can find, the importance of that in both of those career fields. So those are some of the things that come to my mind right off the bat.
Yeah. How do you think that agencies can adopt that like same high performance mindset, especially when there isn't any required physical requirements after the academy? That is one thing that we talk about a lot. It's like you're in the academy, there's so many requirements, you're doing so much physical fitness, and then you graduate, and then there really isn't that standard post graduation. How do you maintain that over a 20, 30-year career?
So I think that's where culture becomes a big part of that, right? So, and as a leader, I think that's, if anything that I have to do well, it's create a culture. Because I'm sure you've heard that term as well, that culture eats policy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? You can have all the policies in the world. Our agency's CLIA accredited. I'm getting ready to go out and accept our 10th award in Little Rock, Arkansas here in a couple weeks. My policies can be great, but if my culture is subpar, our department's going to be subpar, right? So I think it all comes down to culture and really incentivizing, rewarding the behaviors, the positive behaviors, and emulating that as a leader. What you want, what do you expect out of your people? That will create that culture that, that's, you have to have a positive culture.
I've never heard that before, that culture eats policy for breakfast every day.
Yeah.
I like
And
that.
that's, I mean, if you think of that, there's no truer saying. I think you could take that to any business, right? That you could have all these policies and procedures and, the most robust policy manual and recruit manual. But if your folks don't follow those rules when they're out on the street, it's not going to work, right? So got
Yeah,
to have that culture. Culture sets the table.
I really like that. And do you think that if you have a really healthy, positive culture, that you don't have to then mandate? Because that's another conversation that comes up, is that, mandating wellness. But my question is, do you think if you start with culture, then you're almost not forced to mandate? It's like people are wanting to do these things because it's a part of the culture that you created.
I believe that 100%. Mandate. So every wellness initiative that we've done, kind of focusing on wellness, has always been voluntary. I think that when you get into mandating and requiring people to take part in things, especially as it relates to that topic, can be very that can be very tricky, right? When you get into mandating people to do certain things, but when you create that culture that shows that, hey, that's what we all value here because we value you as a person, as not just as an employee. Obviously, we're paying you to do a job, and that's the sole focus, right, of an employee-employer relationship. But we also care about you, Paige, the person, right? That we're going to invest in you, and we're going to give you the tools, the resources, the training, the coaching, the things to make you successful. And I think that's kind of what starts to create that positive culture where you don't have to mandate people. They just need to know what are the expectations, right? And what do we value in this organization?
Yeah. No, thank you for that. For anyone who doesn't know, you have created a really successful wellness program within your organization. You also are a keynote speaker and you teach for the FBI National Academy. So I was hoping that you could teach us some things, maybe like the top three things that you teach that you think are valuable for us to know.
Yeah. So I've been honored to, and I'll kind of rewind a little bit. So I've always had an interest in athletics and and movement and just overall kind of a healthy approach to lifestyle, but I hadn't always had the education components that I needed. Right. I still came from that kind of thought process that from just a mere body composition standpoint, like you just need to eat less and work harder, right? That's what you should be doing. And if you're not doing that, then that's probably why you're not achieving maybe some aesthetic goals or performance goals that you may be looking at. Well, as I started to kind of get more educated on nutrition and movement, then I had this career as a law enforcement officer on the other side. And I started to see that, well, the rules are a little bit different for first responders because we're not sleeping correctly. We're being subjected to high levels of stress that are doing all kinds of crazy things hormonally to our bodies. And those were things that I had never even taken into account. And then, if your nutrition and exercise is off, that just kind of creates a perfect storm for a lot of things to go wrong. So I kind of took some of the education and experiences I'd had as a law enforcement officer and kind of started to make it very specific to the law enforcement field, if you will. When you take all those things and now how can we kind of teach people to maybe mitigate some of the risk factors that are out there, navigate this career maybe a little bit more successfully from a wellness standpoint to where we're hiring healthy people, we're giving them the resources that they need throughout their career, and we're retiring them healthy as well. So with that passion, I kind of started doing some work internally with my own department. We put together a few wellness initiatives about a decade ago is when some of those started, and they've done nothing but grow. In the meantime, I had started getting asked to speak at different conferences and things like that regarding just maybe some of my subject matter expertise in some of these fields, and also some of the work that we had done here at our department, which led to me then being, kind of asked to do a lot of speaking engagements. So I'm part of the FBI Speakers Bureau. I've worked with their leadership programs that they put together, but I've also worked with the U.S. Marshals. I've worked with the HIDA Drug Task Force. I've worked with state, local, federal. It doesn't matter. What I always tell people, the patches change, but the problems stay the same. So when we start looking at things from that perspective, just first responders, I do have experience working with all different levels of government in that respect. And it's been rewarding. It's been super rewarding because I feel like I can relate from having those experiences myself, and then teaching people maybe some ways to cope with the stresses of the career has been super rewarding.
Thank you. And this is why I was so excited to have you as a guest, because when you and I talked for the first time, I was like, wow, like he is a wealth of knowledge, and you have experience traveling around the country teaching these things in a way that people are going to understand and respond to, which I think is really important. It's so important that, of course, there's education, but is it education that resonates? And like you said, you have this experience where you can relate to people, you can have empathy for the unique challenges that first responders are having, in their health and wellness, and then speak and train to that. One of the things that I truly believe in is that if there's that, and you can tell me your philosophy, because I know you have a lot of different philosophies that you shared with me offline, but in order for there to be forward movement and growth, I believe that it's a three-step process. So first is awareness, right? There's this awareness that changes need to be made, or awareness that there's a challenge or an issue or a problem, or however you want to phrase it. And the second one is education. Like you said, how can you educate yourself? And maybe not everyone is going to be a subject matter expert at everything wellness, but how can you educate yourself on the tools and resources that are out there, and things that are going to help you? And then the third one is action. It's implementation. It's then finding that consistency and that dedication to actually do the thing. And so I was maybe hoping that you could explain some of the things that maybe people don't know, like maybe that educational piece of some of the unique challenges that are happening beneath the surface that maybe people don't understand. So that education component. And then what are some of the tools and resources that can help so that they can implement that into their lives?
So it's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm like going through my slide deck in my head that mine, I talk about awareness, education, I throw resources in there, and then plan of action. So that's like exactly what you're talking about, because resources and education are almost, they align very well. But with that, I have an acronym that I use called SPICOT, is what I tell people in my classes. And it's let's look at all this information that we're getting ready to ingest as let's just take some of it and make small, positive, incremental changes over time. Because I think a lot of the issues with wellness, it comes down to this. It's always so overwhelming, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding when it relates to nutrition and what is the right exercise program and how should I be sleeping and what supplement should I take? And then all of a sudden, people are just inundated with too much information. And it's kind of that how to eat an elephant type of thing, right? Let's slow down and let's do it one bite at a time. Mm-hmm. So I think when we approach wellness, I think that's the first part is making that education. You have to meet, and I say this when I train athletes as well, you have to meet the athlete where the athlete is, not where you want them to be, right? So I can't walk into a group of seasoned police officers and start preaching a bunch of wellness. You need to eat like this, you need to exercise. You're going to lose the room in about 10 seconds, right? So you need to meet folks where they're at. You need to have a little bit of humility, walk in, tell them, and I always start off my classes with, hey, I'm not a PhD, I'm not an MD, I'm just a cop talking to cops, right? Because I've lived some of this stuff that I'm going to explain to you. So I think that is the way to approach, especially when you're teaching first responders. So what do we get into? Like, what are some of the nuggets of education that I think are really important that we pass along? That first one being, when this stuff doesn't have to be so complicated, but we actually need to understand what is it that we're trying to correct, right? Because everybody has heard, well, there's, you don't really sleep well, you have high levels of stress, but for a lot of folks, they don't really understand what that means. So what I try to do is dig into, hey, what are some of the biggest risk factors for law enforcement? So we talk about things like a term called insulin resistance, which we can get into here a little bit later. We go into blood work, right? We start talking about our blood panels and we get those done. Hey, what are those telling us? What type of biofeedback are those giving us? When do we need to, maybe further consult with our physician? What does this stuff all mean, and kind of make it a little bit easier to understand, and then kind of segue into nutrition, right? And talking about nutrition, not necessarily from a caloric intake standpoint, right? That eat less, work harder. Let's start talking about, okay, that's relevant. We need to talk about, our protein, carbs, and fats, but then let's talk about how do those foods maybe affect our hormones in our body, right? And then how do some of the stressors of the job also play into that? So I try to teach the class in a way that not only I make it easy to understand how a lot of these things they're not silos. Everything is that it works very synergistic, right? The human body works. A lot of these different things work together. So let's break that down. Let's make it easy to understand. And then let's give people some very small things that they can do immediately to start affecting change. And a few of those would be, hey, if we're not moving, let's start moving. Like, let's just start doing something. You don't have to be in a CrossFit class. You don't need to be in a weight room squatting 500 pounds. You just need to move your body. And that could be as simple as going for a walk, right? We start getting some movement. Then we start talking about nutrition and maybe what some of those good substitutes for foods, a little bit healthier approach to food would be for some people. So this is a very robust topic. I will go on forever on these things, but that's really what we get into. And I try to make it very specific to some of the stressors that we encounter in law enforcement and just how from a metabolic health standpoint, we're different because we are.
Yeah. I'm so excited to talk to you because everything that you're saying, I'm like, yes, like I completely agree with you. And that has been a lot of my experience too. Like, I'm not a cop talking to cops. I'm an outsider talking to cops, they both have challenges, right? You're always going to try to speak to people in different ways. But, what I learned really, really early on is exactly what you said. Like, you cannot walk in to a room full of cops or first responders and say, don't do this. Do this.
Don't do that.
As soon as you do that, everyone is on the defense and they're like, who are you coming in here telling me what to do? I think it's human nature, but I think especially in this profession, it's like, who are you? Like, we don't even know who you are. You're coming in like telling us to change our habits and our choices. And I think that can put people on the defensive, and we definitely don't want that, and I remember I was at a conference one time and I was presenting later and I was talking about movement and mobility and things of that nature. And I was like, man, I have an uphill battle because everyone was talking about like some pretty powerful topics. And I was like, I think I have an uphill battle. And then one of the presenters got up there and said, stop drinking coffee. And you could just feel the room,
Mhm.
the whole room. It was like this very tangible discomfort and lost the room in 2 seconds, And I think that you really want to try to not do that because then you're never ever going to get, it doesn't matter how valuable your information or how true or how right your information is as soon as you lose someone, it's so, so hard to get them
Yeah.
back on track and listening to you. So I think that meeting people where they are, understanding. And I love that you said healthier. Like maybe, instead of doing this, we try this because it's a little bit healthier.
Yeah.
It's not stop doing that. And I think that that's the small incremental changes that create that huge impact over time. Maybe someone who's drinking 5 Red Bulls in a day, like what if we tried 3 Red Bulls in a day? Let's start there, or maybe there's a healthier swap for the Red Bull that's still kind of like scratching that itch for you, but it's healthier, with the
Yeah.
ingredient list or whatever. So, but I also, one of the things you said was first step physical sometimes. And I completely get on board with that thought process because sometimes when you're talking about wellness as a whole, it can be a little sensitive. If people are resistant to mental health or if people are resistant to changing the way that they eat or whatever, sometimes you can get them on board with the physical because that's more tangible. I think that if you go into a room full of cops and you say who wants their back to feel better, most people are going to get on board with that, and you're like, all right, let's start there. Like
Yeah.
let's focus on the end result that's going to make you feel better and that you can actually see, and then we can address some of the other things once you have more of that receptiveness to the things that we're doing and we've built a little bit of trust in that space.
Yeah. And that's why I think wellness is like, there is no better topic to really start talking about with first responders because everybody wants to be healthy, number one. But this is something that directly correlates to the quality of life of your people. It's not necessarily for the agency, right? It's not the amount of stops that you're making, the tickets that you're writing. Like, it's not agency focused, it's really employee focused. So if right off the bat they understand that, hey, man, the chief is bringing this program in, or whoever's bringing this program in because they want me to be healthier. I always tell people the goal of this program that we talk about is to cash more pension checks, right? Because you're going to bankrupt that pension fund because you just won't die because you're going to be so healthy, and you kind of get a laugh out of that. But they all start thinking about that because most cops that are midway through their career or later in their career, they want to make it to retirement and they want to be healthy, right? So I think it's really easy to introduce these topics as long as you don't do exactly what you said, that fatal flaw of walking in and turning the whole room off immediately by, making a discouraging comment about how many cops are fat and out of shape. Like, people already know that, right? If they've got some work to do, they already know that. You don't have to point that out. They want you to teach them, to guide them. And that's really what we do. We facilitate. You do the same thing. We facilitate. We give people education. We give them a pathway. We give them an entry point. We encourage them, and then we let them do their thing. So cops are smart. If you give
Yeah.
them the tool, you give them the tactical plan, right? As long as they got a plan, they'll follow it and they can be successful with it. And that's where I think culture becomes such a big deal, right? Because when you've got that culture within an agency that promotes that, right, everybody's on board. So I've noticed it at our own PD that, we just went through a huge remodel. We got some new locker rooms for men and women because I just felt like the ones that we had were kind of old and dilapidated. And who wants to start their shift in a dark, smelly, dingy locker room? So we redid our locker rooms. They're beautiful. And we have a huge wellness facility now that includes everything from state of the art strength training equipment, cardiovascular equipment. We've got everything's roughed in for a sauna, a cold plunge. We've got a meditation room with recovery chairs. We've got all these things that lends to that culture, right? So when the agency is doing things like this, I started noticing as the conversations change in the hallway, right? People aren't talking about they're talking about wellness related things. Hey, what'd you bring for lunch today? They're having conversations about food, or hey, I saw you down in the weight room the other day, and this and that and the other. So it really, that it's just that culture, I think, becomes so important, because once you get the culture change, it kind of takes care of itself.
Yeah. Well, and sorry, I lost my train of thought and all. Pause here. But I think ultimately what I hear is that through culture, you are really making wellness normal. Like it's not something that's taboo. If everyone's talking about it and they're talking about what they had for lunch and they're talking about their workout plans, and this is the new locker room talk, is focused around wellness, then to me, that feels like it's normal. People aren't judging you. There's no like sense of, oh, you're weak because you're doing XYZ. It's like, no, like we encourage that. We think that you're really strong. Like we want you to be the best version of yourself. We want you to be the healthiest version of yourself that you can be, so that you can show up for your family, so that you can, get to retirement and live as long as you were in the career in retirement,
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes we get so focused on, to your point of what you said, statistics. And again, it's the awareness piece of it. Like I think it's important to have awareness around things and to have, education. But I think the numbers, like we have to understand that these are people, and sometimes when you get so deep into statistics, it feels very cold and it doesn't feel relational and it doesn't feel like there's a human element to that. And I think that we have to focus on solutions. And like you said, having a game plan. And I want to dive into that a little bit too, because I want to know the importance of planning for you. But I always tell people, and I say it in a couple different ways because I think you have to be able to teach things in different ways for people to understand, but focusing on the end result, how do you want your life to look? What is the vacation, if you will? What is your why? We can say this in a lot of different ways, but I think if we can focus on that, it's like, it's always to me when I ask people those questions, like, what do you want, out of life or out of this career? Physically, mentally, how do you want to feel? What is your wellness why? Why is wellness important to you? It's always longevity. There's always different questions or different answers, excuse me, to that question. But at its core, it's longevity. No one wants to be sick. No one wants to be injured. No one wants to get to the end of this career and die in 2, 3 years. Nobody wants that. Everyone wants to feel as good as possible for as long as possible and have longevity. And so I think if we can start to focus on that, like, okay, that's the goal, then what are the steps? What is that action plan that we have to take to get there? How do you formulate plans? What does that look like for you?
So one comment on the longevity. I think you're absolutely right that everybody wants to get to the end of that career, to their pension time, understand their why, and then be capable of executing on that. I take it one step further for people and say, look, let's look at the difference between health span and longevity, right?
Mm.
Two different things. Where
Yeah.
if your goal is to retire and live to be 90, well, let's push health span and longevity as far together as we can, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to live to be 90 if I'm sick and have no mobility, no function from 70 to 90, right? So with everything that we do, let's look at how, and then understanding how eating right, moving, sleeping, decreasing stress pushes health span to move with longevity, right? So excellent point, and I agree with you 100%. Sometimes I try to tie that in just to kind of, sometimes you see the bell go off in people's head when you talk about that. It's not necessarily how long you live, it's the quality of life, right?
Yeah.
And
I
how long you
agree with
can
you.
maintain that.
Have you read
But
the
for,
book? Have you
oh,
read the book Outlive?
no, because it's like 1,000 pages at Peter Attia. I've heard it. I mean, I listen to Peter's podcast all the time,
Yeah.
but I have not dove into the War and Peace of Outlive. Yeah,
Well,
I've heard
I
that's
have audio, so like an audio book. I'm definitely not going to be
that's a good
that,
idea.
but like audiobook. But he says that and I completely agree. It's not necessarily about living long. It's about living well. It's about living long and well,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it's like how I
Yep.
love that you said that and you added that. So thank you.
Yeah. So I guess when we're looking at a plan, do you want to kind of hear specifically kind of how I coach people with a plan, or kind of what I do myself, or just kind of a mixture of
Yeah, whatever you want to share. Yeah, I'm
a
open
little
ears.
bit?
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to the small positive incremental changes over time, right? When we start putting a plan together, number one, I'm a big 80-20 guy, especially when I'm coaching people, because I think that goes right in lockstep with asking somebody to do a complete 180 overnight. Number one, we start to see huge issues with sustainability of that. And a lot of times, the way that people approach that, if they're not being coached appropriately, there can be some long-term ramifications. If you're going into a severe calorie deficit, if you're upping your training time, those can be some real issues if we don't kind of stair step that in an appropriate way. But
Yeah.
so I think telling people, hey, let's kind of take that 80-20 approach and let's start looking at things, and what are the things that we can control, and maybe what are some of the things that we can't control. Because what comes up all the time, and some of the most difficult people to coach are people that work shift work. And that's what we do, right? When God never intended us to stay up all night, right? And unfortunately, a lot of first responders are in that boat, that we have to deal with changes in our circadian rhythms and things like that. So that's one of those things that we can't necessarily control, but we can be aware, and hopefully kind of try to do things to mitigate some of the issues that come along with shift work. So I think from a planning perspective, let's look at the things that we can control, and let's start putting some systems in place to improve upon maybe what our routine is now. And I think getting people to understand, getting things into a routine, right? When you start doing some lifestyle changes, you start making changes to those routines. Those simple changes start to actually become lifestyle changes, right? They become habits, they become lifestyle changes, and then all of a sudden you've got something that you can sustain over time. So I think putting some reasonable change in place, and that could be something as simple as, hey, let's start drinking more water, or to your point, let's cut down from 5 Red Bulls to 3, right? Let's make that our goal this week. And then, hey, we're going to start walking every morning in a fasted state for 30 minutes, and explaining the why behind some of those things that I teach. So it's really just, I think, taking some of these small positive incremental changes, putting a plan in place that we can start executing on these slowly, that builds momentum, right? When people start feeling better, they start sleeping better, they start seeing changes on the scale, if that's what's important to you, that creates momentum, that creates that feedback loop that people need, and it starts to compound, right? Those little wins start to compound over time, and then you start seeing these changes in people. And that's why I continue to do this, because it's the emails, it's the calls, it's the texts. I'm down 20 pounds. My blood sugar, my hemoglobin A1C is down. Like, I don't have type 2 diabetes anymore. Like, all these little things that people put in some work to do, when they see results, it's super motivating. And it all comes back to having a plan, executing on that plan. But as a coach, you've got to make that plan realistic. You've got to make it something that they can accomplish, and then start building upon those wins along the way.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. And I know we talked about this a little bit, so I want to circle back before we
Sure.
run out of time, but talking about hormones, talking about insulin resistance, like maybe some of the things that people don't understand. On the surface, we're like, okay, eat better, exercise, do these things. And then we talked about kind of understanding the why and the importance of knowing the why. Can you explain maybe why these things are important, and how first responders are maybe different from a hormone level or
Sure.
an insulin level?
Sure. So with first responders, and for a lot of people, this will be review. But when we talk about nutrition, specifically how food relates to what is the hormonal impact of food in the body. The reason first responders are different is because when we start looking at hormonal impacts of the job, right? So we've got hormonal impacts of food, we've got hormonal impacts of different things, but what does the job actually do to some of the hormones that help regulate some of these metabolic processes in our body? So I talk to people a lot about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous responses, right? So parasympathetic, the way that I explain that is generally when I'm teaching a group or somebody's watching this podcast, that's the nervous state that you're in right now. Like you feel safe, everything feels good, you're not in a stress state, everything, you no type of stress response in the body whatsoever. Now, the opposite of that would be that sympathetic nervous state, right? Where the body's essentially in kind of that fight or flight mode, right? It's that kind of system that we evolved with over time from way back when that, as we evolved as a human being, as a species, the sympathetic nervous state, fight or flight, the body does certain things when we're in that sympathetic nervous state as a protective mechanism, right? So that we have energy to fight or flight, and that the body is protecting itself from whatever harm may be causing that nervous state. Well, when you break it down and you look at cops and the way that in which our typical day goes, there's a term called hypervigilance, and hypervigilance is just essentially that accelerated nervous state, that stress state that cops are in all the time. And the easiest way to explain that is, or at least the way that I explain it is, it's simply that hypervigilant state is protective, right? Because cops don't want to be in a situation, they don't want to die, right? Essentially. So anytime you're on a traffic stop, you're going to a domestic dispute, more high priority calls, a robbery in progress, whatever that may be, you have certain stress hormones in the body that elevate just based on the calls for service that you're going to. Well, when you break that down and start to look at metabolically what starts to change in the body, well, we see dysregulation of the hormone insulin. We see that the actual, the body is actually, our blood sugar levels are going up based on these type of sympathetic nervous state responses. And I try to bring that all together and kind of show folks not only the fact that this is happening, but then what are some of the things that we can do to help mitigate those responses in the body? Because what they do when we spend too much time in that stress state, and I'm really kind of condensing this material because this would take us a little while to get through, but when we spend too much time in that nervous state, it affects us from a metabolic health standpoint, right? These little changes in our nervous state, they drive up our blood sugar, they drive up our insulin levels. And when we start to understand things about blood sugar and insulin, they run the show when it comes to metabolic health. When you have high levels of insulin, you can't burn body fat, right? When your insulin levels are high, you're storing body fat. So I try to relate this to a lot of cops that, hey, you came on the job, you were healthy and you were fit and you coming out of the academy, you were ready to go, right? But then 3 to 5 years into your career, nothing's really changed with your diet. You're still exercising. Your sleep may not be as good, but you're definitely dealing with more stress. And now all of a sudden you're seeing some changes in your body. Maybe your blood pressure is going up at that first doctor's visit. Maybe you're taking a notch out of the gun belt, right? And you having to loosen that up a little bit because we're putting on weight. There are things that happen over the course of this career, and a lot of it can be attributed to when we're in a high stress state, our body is doing things generally negatively to compensate for that. And that can manifest itself in a lot of these issues from high blood pressure, weight gain, which then leads to insulin resistance, chronic disease. It's kind of it's a track that you don't want to get on, but we see it very commonly in all the first responder professions.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. And, I think that there are a lot of people who don't know that. So I really appreciate the education, because I think when you can start to understand that, then you can give yourself a little bit of grace. But then, like you said, you can start to slowly make some changes that are going to be beneficial for you over time. But when people don't understand that, and like you said, just trying to eat less and work harder and it's still not working. I know a lot of officers who are fit, who are like in the gym, they're doing all the things, and they're pre-diabetic, and there's certain things that happen. So I think that it gives that like permission to exhale a little bit and just understand like there are other things beneath the surface. And the more you can understand that, then the better the action plan can be moving forward.
And it's interesting that you say that the amount of people that are fit, but maybe are still what you consider metabolically unhealthy. When you look at the 5 risk factors for metabolic syndrome, waist circumference and triglycerides and HDL and some of the things that go along with that, one thing that's not included in that is body weight, right? So when you're actually, the point being, you can't judge a book by its cover. There's a lot of cops that are super fit. They appear to be super fit when we're just kind of looking at it from the outside, but are still very metabolically unhealthy. And that leads to increased risk for all types of things, from type 2 diabetes to cardiovascular disease. So we need to understand some of these things that are going on in the background. And I really encourage people through that education component, to understand nutrition, understand movement, understand your blood work, work with a qualified physician, and track these things throughout your career. Don't wait until an issue becomes chronic. Let's deal with it at the acute phase when we start seeing changes.
Yeah. I feel like we could talk for hours and hours and hours about every single thing
Like
that
we
you just
could.
said. And, one of the things that we know now, and it goes back to like stats, right? And we're still seeing like the stats that like suicide is the number one reason for death in law enforcement. But now we're seeing that it's still too high, of course. But cardiovascular events are actually the leading cause. And
Yeah.
we know that that's because of everything that you just said and more. And so we could talk, I think, for an hour about that. So I appreciate, the understanding. You said this earlier, that it's all interconnected, and how
Yep.
can you focus on the whole? And when we hear the word holistic, I think sometimes still people like have a little bit of eye roll, but if we can think of it with the spelling of WHOLE, like
I like that.
holistic, then it's a little less woo woo and like, frou frou or whatever you want to call it. And it's like, how can we focus on the whole person? How can we focus on the whole picture so that you can live well for longer? I wanted to ask you before we sign off, I have a couple questions. Why do you think that some people and some members of leadership are still resistant to this idea of wellness or proactive wellness initiatives? And the second part to that question is, what do you think is the cost, financially and humanly of not prioritizing these things?
Yeah, and I think the people that, like you said, may still be resistant to that. I think it comes back to, and we've touched on it already, education,
Mm.
right? And you don't know what you don't know type of thing. That if you value your people, which most leaders do, um, you want the best for them. And let's face it, a strong, healthy police force is an effective police force. They're going to serve the community better. They're going to be healthier, more motivated individuals. You're going to have a positive culture within your agency. So I think a lot of leaders that don't buy into that, it simply is, it's an education thing. They haven't been given, or they don't fully understand the benefits, because maybe as a leader, some leaders can be reluctant to admit, I don't know, right? I don't know the answer to that question, or I don't know much about this. And if wellness isn't necessarily their specialty, maybe there's a little bit of reluctance there. So we go back to humility, have a little, be humble, refer to people maybe that are on your staff that are subject matter experts, let them lead the charge with that, and they'll bring you along with them. So I think a lot of times that's probably the biggest reluctance, is an education part.
Yeah. And what's the cost?
Everything, right? I think the cost is everything. I tell my people that, yeah, that we want to bring you in healthy, we want to retire you healthy, but along the way, shame on you if you don't take the opportunity to develop some fabulous, relationships, skill sets along the way that will allow you to absolutely flourish in retirement, either with another municipality, in the private sector, or if you just want to sit on the beach, go ahead and do that, whatever that retirement looks like. But if you've got 20, 30 years here to build positive relationships with people, put yourself in a position to be successful, in your career, in your health, in your fitness, and really, that it's incumbent on the employee at that point to do that work. But the cost of not investing in that, of giving people that education, giving them those resources, I think it's a huge detriment, not only to the agency, but to the profession, because that as leaders, we're in these positions to not only affect change within our agencies, but let's leave the profession better than we found it. And I think if anything good, the one, or I should say, not anything good, but the best thing that I think I've seen how this profession has evolved in the last 27 years that I've been involved has been on the wellness side.
Mm.
We've made vast improvements from when I was hired in '99, in the mental health physical health, every aspect of wellness has improved. So that's very encouraging. And with this new generation of officers, I don't see that stopping. I see that continuing, and we're continuing to put good leaders in positions to facilitate that. And I think we're going to keep making great strides.
I agree. And, I've definitely not been in this world for as long as you have. I've, only been in this space now for 8 years, but I've seen great strides even in 8 years. And so I agree.
Yeah.
I'm excited about the future and what that's going to look like. And, in the context of the younger up and coming generation, what words of wisdom would you share in the context of wellness that maybe you wish you would have known earlier, or something that's helped you along the way? You've given tons of advice already throughout this whole podcast, but
Yeah.
short little snippet.
No, I love that question. And honestly, I have 3 boys, and I give them the same advice. I've got a almost 22-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 17-year-old. And I always tell them, and I'll use the 22-year-old for example, because most of the kids we're hiring now are about that age. Every decision that you make as a 22-year-old, be thinking about how that investment, how that decision, whether it's financially, it's from a physical fitness standpoint, it's from a relationship building standpoint, how is that 22-year-old investing in that 52-year-old, right? Or that 50-year-old? Because when you start thinking along those lines, not only are you setting yourself up to make good decisions now, but when you get to the end of this career, you're going to be really, really happy that 22-year-old invested in the 52-year-old, right? And a lot of that I relate back to financial. I used to kind of think that was more of a financial health thing, that, hey, start investing in those 457Bs and those Roth IRAs at 22, because you're going to be really happy when you're 52. But when I started to think about that more, you should be looking at that from all aspects, right? Especially relationship building. We need community. We need people around us that support us, and they're there when the times are good, the times are bad, and so you can really look at just about anything that you do, and with that perspective, that long-term perspective. And I think that's the biggest advice I maybe wish I would have had, is to invest in my 50-year-old self, right?
Yeah.
Because it goes quick.
I know. Well, I appreciate that. And I think those are great words of wisdom. And, I think sometimes we don't have that forward thinking when we're young. And so hearing that from someone who has been through it and has that perspective is so helpful, because you want to make your future self proud. I don't think any of us as humans have ever gotten through life unscathed. And there's never going to be a time where you don't look back and say, I wish, but how can we minimize how many wishes we have as we get older? And I think that if you start early investing in yourself, that's one less I wish statement that you have to make.
I agree 100%. It's perfect.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it so much. And we might have to have another part 2 episode, because I feel like there's still so much more that and could offer, but I really appreciate your time here today.
Thank you. I'd love to do that. I'd love to dig into more.
Awesome. We'll talk soon then.